This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. This is episode 212 of the podcast, and I am in Longmont, Colorado, not too far from home today, right across the street from one of my favorite bakeries in all of Colorado, Babette's. I'm at Primitive Beer, and joining me on the podcast are Lisa and Brandon Boldt. Welcome to the podcast, Lisa and Brandon.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, it's great to be here.
And I should say Pearl is in the background.
She is.
Yeah.
You might hear quite a bit of her cooing and
Squawks.
and squawking. Yeah, she's an exotic bird of sorts.
We operate a family-friendly podcast here, and craft beer, I believe, should be family-friendly and embrace that kind of lifestyle approach to what we do. And so, yeah, Pearl's in the background. Maybe we'll hear from her. Maybe we won't.
Maybe.
No, you'll definitely hear from her.
She's very vocal.
Sure. If you're not familiar with Primitive Beer, they specialize in spontaneously fermented wild ales, and those with fruit, those without fruit. They won a 2019 silver medal at the Great American Beer Festival in the experimental beer category. And I can't wait to talk about how you brew spontaneously fermented beer here in the high desert of Colorado, and build it in a characterful and interesting, creative way. But first, what if you could chill your beer with a more efficient chiller? The answer, G&D Chiller's new micro-channel condensers. G&D's micro-channel condensers are highly efficient in hotter regions, use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers, which provides less opportunity for leaks and lower global warming potential. G&D Chiller's engineers are committed to green technology design, developing a more efficient chiller for the brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at gdchillers.com. Also, support for this episode comes from BSG Craft Brewing, announcing a cool new product offering, T45 lupulin-enriched hop pellets. They're more efficient than T90s. T45 hop pellets contain a higher concentration of aromatic oils and bittering resins with a reduced level of polyphenols and plant material. This means a big, delicious hop flavor with fewer pounds per barrel, creating a more cost-efficient and sustainable beer production thanks to reduced wort losses. Supplies are limited. Secure your order today at go.bsgcraft.com/T-45. Before we start talking, I also want to remind everybody, I guess I'm not reminding because I'm telling you for the first time, next week, Thursday, 9 a.m. on November 11th, we are releasing our annual Best in Beer podcast, also pushing the Best in Beer issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine live, all happening at 9 a.m. Mountain Time on Thursday, 11/11. Tune in for that. Joe Stang and I will be offering our annual podcast, running through all of our Best in Beer, Reader's Choice, Editor's Picks, and everything else. The following week on Friday, 11/19, we'll run the Critics podcasts, where each of our critics, Kate Burnett, Stan Hieronymus, Samar Kadari, yours truly, Alex Kidd of Don't Drink Beer, and Joe Stang will all share our personal favorites of the year. We've got exciting things on the horizon for the rest of this year in the podcast with some international stuff. And 2022 is shaping up to be an awesome year. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope you continue to. Lisa and Brandon, let's talk about Primitive Beer.
Yes.
Give me the kind of brief history of Primitive and some of and your all's collective background in craft beer. What led you all to the point where you are now, operating this small family-owned, spontaneously focused brewery here in Longmont, Colorado?
Sure. So we started in craft beer probably first with home brewing. Lots and lots of home brewing, getting really creative with, making beers, and then they weren't great. And then we learned what made them not great. And then we worked toward improving ourselves and forward until we started in the industry at Odd 13 in Lafayette. Brandon was the head brewer. I ran the tap room. And that was a really eye-opening experience, that you could do this thing that you're very passionate about and it could be your job, which is, people know that, but I think it was groundbreaking for us. And then with more time, we started to find lambic and sour beers first, and then lambics and goos. And got so excited about that. Hey, Pearl. And decided that's what we wanted to focus on specifically and have a brewery dedicated exactly to that and not make anything else. And that's how Primitive was founded.
Yeah, I should mention that entering the professional brewing arena was never, we'd never set out to actually become brewers. Lisa and I met in graduate school for geology. So we've definitely been going with the flow in a lot of ways. And make no mistake about it, Primitive Beer was Lisa's idea at first.
Really?
Yeah. When we, like she said, when we'd accidentally kind of fallen into the beer industry in Colorado, vis-a-vis, through Odd 13, probably 2 years into it, right on my birthday, she made the announcement that, if we're really going to keep doing this, we should be doing it to, our fullest, kind of the fullest extreme and really put everything into it. So at that point, the idea of Primitive was still nebulous. We knew it had to focus around barrels and spontaneous beer to some capacity. But in the beginning, when we were first kind of putting this business plan together, it wasn't originally an only spontaneous beer blendery in the style of Belgian Lambic. There's a little more breadth in terms of what we were going to play around with. But the more we started talking and the more we really started being honest with ourselves about what we were most fascinated by and what beers that we wanted to drink, it soon, as long as we were doing something that made no sense, why not just make it as nonsensical as possible? So Primitive Beer really became just, in our minds, it's the idea that if you took a lambic blendery outside of the Pajottenland, outside of the Sun River Valley, and accidentally dropped it somewhere else, what would that look like? What would that be like? In case I make the mistake of accidentally, and it very rarely happens, but if I accidentally call our beer lambic, make no mistake about it, we know that we're not in the right geographic appellation for it. We have the utmost respect for those who are producing it in Belgium. And we make method traditional beer, but damn do we wish sometimes that we did live in that region of Belgium to be able to do it and call it lambic.
Sure. So you mentioned that, if you're going to do this crazy thing, which is pretty crazy to launch your own brewing business, you're in a state like Colorado that has a lot of breweries. There's a lot of competition for people making and selling beer here. There's some benefit to having a narrow but intense focus, and that you're not trying to capture all of the market. You are just trying to capture that kind of audience that is really interested in this. But at the same time, you also look to sell your beer to a broader national audience that's interested in this. But still, from a business perspective, why on earth would you focus? You're making this kind of spontaneous beer in a place that is not necessarily known for having a great microbial culture. It's very, very dry here. Winters are incredibly cold, too cold for a lot, in a lot of ways for what would be traditional lambic brewing. The
issue is also how dry it is.
Yeah.
It's so dry here. We lose so much to evaporation.
Sure.
Absolutely, and that all factors into it. The simple answer would be we're socialists, and it's a terrible business model. I would not suggest anyone follows us. If I were to stretch that out a little bit and put on a capitalist hat, I'd say that Colorado has, despite definitely having to work through some hurdles from a climatic and a brewing process standpoint to make this beverage we love so much, Colorado has an incredibly educated beer consumer kind of fan base. So as a result, while we might have to work, I won't say harder, because brewing spontaneous beer is very difficult anywhere. But while we might have to get a little more creative in some ways to turn those really esoteric dials in such a way that creates a favorable product within 3 to 4 years, knowing that we would at least have some people who had some idea of what was inspiring us, what is a favorable versus kind of degradational outcome of spontaneous fermentation, some degree of education there, or at least a population that is ready to engage and has a desire to learn, even if they're not familiar with what we're creating in the beginning. So that was a big part of why Colorado.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you all launched this, there have been the approach to life and business structure have varied from time to time. It is not necessarily and has not been a full-time gig. It has been a project, and that's one of the benefits of brewing this kind of beer. You can make it in a season and let it ride through. But you have also maintained employment other places in order to kind of create some of that economic security through this.
Yeah, it's amazing how much, even if you're only brewing in the winter, how much the rest of the year gets filled in with packaging in the non-brewing season. And then the fruit season feels like it comes sooner and sooner every year. I mean, mid-June is peaches, or mid-July is peaches. And by the time peaches are done, it's cherries and then other stone fruit. And then you want to do any kind of berry. And so it really sneaks up on you. And that's packaging, fruit, and then it's all of a sudden brew season again. So in that way, it is seasonal, but it's rapid. But yes, we have other jobs. Brandon is transitioning into full-time here at Primitive, which is really exciting. It's something we've been building toward for 4 years now.
Sure.
It's always been a side project, but it really needs our focus now with all this beer that's aged and ready to package and enjoy.
Absolutely. From a business model standpoint, that was part of it, was understanding that for many years, taking any money from this project or taking other resources away from it would not really allow it to function. Being able to, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the specifics later, but being able to start this without having a brew house here, without having to invest in some of the more expensive equipment for the style of beer that we're brewing at the scale that we're looking to do it at. So being able to say, all right, we're not going to take money from it. We're not going to buy a brew house. We are not going to do some of these more conventional components of starting a brewery, allowed us to basically now build up more than 4 years of spontaneous stock in a way that we find super exciting. And I think we're both pleased with the results so far. And
yeah, I mean, if we were to get a new fruit shipment tomorrow, we could put it on 3-year aged beer and have it be ready, in a matter of weeks.
Right.
Then it would need to condition, but we're ready to go on any number of opportunities.
Ready to get weird with it at any moment.
At the drop of a hat.
But yeah, having
But
other...
right, that runway, normal brewery can, get into operation and, put beer in tanks, and within 3 or 4 weeks, they've got something that they can sell.
This is our 3-year version. We're now ready to go.
Yeah, our much more esoteric, long-winded kind of brewery or beer project at that point. And
and you had some, fun strategies for having beer to sell earlier on, basically, selling, lambic in a bag, uncarbonnated, lambic or lambic style beer. I'm going to catch myself every time I say that
you
too.
can say it. We can't say it.
We always try to do that, Belgian style, lambic style, or, because obviously you're not in Belgium, you're not in the Seine Valley, you're not making that thing with that appellation. And that is fair. And it's a reasonable ask from those makers to be considerate of that kind of thing. No judgment on that whatsoever.
Yeah.
I will just try to maintain and speak about it, properly through but anyway, let's pivot and talk about some of that strategy, because like you said, you don't have a brew house here. You're brewing wort other places. You're definitely brewing wort structured with recipes that will build the kind of components in that wort as you cool ship them that can create beer that will, ferment and acidify and otherwise develop that funk and character over time. We can talk about how you build those recipes. We can talk about how you convince other breweries to brew this difficult dextrinous wort. Before we do that, a brewery might have 99 problems, but your fruit supplier shouldn't be one. Old Orchard is already known for their quality concentrates, but they also pride themselves on consistent product and reliable supply. When brewers need assistance, Old Orchard is just an email, phone call, or even a text away. Based in Greater Grand Rapids, Michigan, better known as Beer City, USA, Old Orchard is core to the brewing community. To join their fruit family, learn more at www.oldorchard.com brewer. Also, are you ready to brew like a pro? ProBrew has the equipment, systems, and technology to take your brewery production to the next level. Check out www.probrew.com for ProCarb inline carbonation technology, ProFill rotary filling and seaming can fillers, the Alchemator inline alcohol separation system, 7 to 50 barrel brew houses, and more. ProBrew offers the craft beer industry innovative solutions to help you brew like a pro. Go to www.probrew.com for more info. So you set this up. You know you're going to have to sit on beer for a few years before you're really going to have a volume to sell of the
if any of it comes out.
If any of it comes out, because you're taking a giant leap of faith. Yeah. And so you do that. You rent a space. Not spending a couple $100,000 on a brew house, certainly a much better capital, position to be in. It still creates a challenge of having to brew wort. You have a cool ship here at the brewery in Longmont. So you're brewing wort and then you're bringing it back here, cooling, inoculating it overnight in that kind of traditional method. But talk to me a little bit about designing a beer for that.
Yeah.
And then how you've made ingredient choices, for the kind of, core wort in your beer.
Sure. So on one level, the design was pretty simple and straightforward, given that the Belgians allowed us access to understand what traditional lambic looks like in terms of, let's call it approximately 60% Pilsen equivalent malted barley, 40% raw wheat, use of debittered hops, a turbid mashing schedule, as well as then a marathon boil. Sets the stage. While that seems pretty constrained or rigid, there's still a fair amount of room of these dials that might not make an influence on what that wort tastes like immediately, or even in the next 3 days to 3 months, but extrapolated or amplified by time, all of those very small dials have a profound effect. So a big part of what some adjustments that we've made over time really have to do with, as you mentioned, evaporation and the fact that we're living in this high arid desert environment, not to mention that we're, also have an elevation where evaporation is happening more quickly. Call it a mile high or whatever. And those
we boil at a lower temperature up here,
right? Exactly. Yeah, I think on the biggest, the highest temperature we can get our boil at is if we're going real vigorous, we can get it up to a whopping 206 degrees Fahrenheit, as opposed to that classic 212. So there's already that effect. What I will say, something that's not talked about too often, or maybe people are starting to talk about it a bit more with spontaneous beer, is the loss in the coolship and the evaporation just of taking a vessel that is designed specifically for good heat transfer. But that also means, if it's a shallower, wider vessel, you're going to have more evaporation, especially of a really warm fluid and, with dry, cold air. So taking a look at those losses in the coolship in the 12 to 18 hours that we're allowing it to chill naturally at that time of year, and understanding the effect of just whether you have a low pressure system, what the atmospheric conditions are looking like at that point, and then what that means, I would say primarily both from an original gravity standpoint the next morning, as well as what that looks like from a hop bitterness standpoint. People talk about, all right, you want your maybe approximately 1 to 1.5 pounds of whole cone debittered hops in your boil per barrel. But people aren't really specifying, okay, is that your pre-boil concentration, your post-boil concentration, your post-coolship concentration?
Right.
And, that can potentially explain why there's a 50% change between a pound per barrel and a pound and a half in those estimates. But at the same time,
how has that impacted what you do? Has it changed the coolship geometry that you use? Has it changed the way that you've adjusted hopping rates for that so that you end up with a beer right? Or
totally, yeah.
Are you literally watching the barometer and understanding that even different barometric pressures are going to lead to different evaporation rates for you here in a sensitive environment?
I will say that as a former paleoclimatologist, a geology nerd, looking at those atmospheric conditions and understanding the changes in the weather is certainly something that we geek out to and factor in. But I would also say that we're not looking at it from a super quantitative standpoint. I think we use a lot of that data, a lot of that information, a little more qualitatively, just similarly to our blending philosophy in that way. So when we know that it's going to be colder at night, or we're going to have a lower pressure system, or et cetera, we will adjust our batch volumes accordingly with that understanding, and with an understanding of relatively what percentage of that wort is going to evaporate at different volumes, which correspond to different cooling rates. We have an understanding of what we want that gravity to look like coming out of the kettle post boil, as well as what we want our hopping rate to look like. So, for example, if we have a colder night, let's say with real low pressure, our coolship holds about 45 volumetric barrels at flood depth. We are generally brewing on 30 barrel systems at any given time. So we might, if it's a colder night with the opportunity to cool quicker, we will fill that coolship more, understanding that we will have many barrels of loss at that point. And we might be able to adjust down our gravity as well as adjust down our hopping rate, because then post-evaporative concentration is going to have higher gravity. Right. And all of a sudden for that,
the H2O evaporates off, but the hops do not.
Exactly. So, right. So understanding that and what that looks like, it can be pretty important. And that's something that we've dialed in over now. I want to say it's about what our first coolship season was 2017 or 2016-17. So we had the 16-17, 17-18, 18-19, 19-20, 20-21. We're going to go on to our, it's lambic math is always weird because we're going in, we've only would have had our third anniversary and we're going into our sixth coolship season or something like that. So, that's definitely something that we've adjusted accordingly. And it's a fun, interesting moving target, given that we have to both understand how our beers continue to evolve, and knowing that, all right, if we make a small adjustment in year 1 or year 2 or year 3, it might take us quite a bit of time before we have a better understanding of what that looks like, and still wanting to fill barrels that are a pertinent part of a blend at only 1 or 2 years versus beers that we design, big air quotes on design at that point, but that we would hope have the longevity to make it to 3 and 4 years, or, if things get real weird, even can age gracefully even past that point. So despite having a single type of beer that fills those barrels and, for all intents and purposes, a single recipe, those micro adjustments that do get amplified by time gives us a lot of opportunity for blending stock and for purposefully creating beers that will evolve in different ways. And the hopping rates that we take, certainly, with or without that evaporative concentration, just adjusting those hopping rates as well make a big difference in terms of acidification versus tasteful kind of malt-based oxidation or funkiness, and what that can mean from the context of a blend. So it is important for us to have some variety and variability in aging potential.
Is there anything to the choice in, say, Pilsner malt, or I'm assuming you're also using a significant portion of wheat as tradition would have it, in terms of ingredient selections around those?
So for us, selection, and we can go into why those ingredients specifically work for this,
sure,
and selective pressures. But I will say that we use only Colorado ingredients for the production of our of everything here.
Yeah. So our grains were grown 30 miles east of here, and then they're malted in Fort Collins, 50 miles north of here. And so they're super local. They're really, really local, which is very cool considering how immediately local our yeast is. And then the hops and fruit are all from the mountains as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we're a terroir-driven brewery, or a brewery that it gets excited from being able to showcase the microflora, it was a logical extension to say, let's have that terroir showcase really everything from a Colorado standpoint. And going back to that idea of socialism, or really not caring from a business standpoint of, making money, if part of what we are doing is also supporting that local agricultural community, keeping money in our local community, it's not to say that Colorado grains or fruits or hops are any better or worse than Belgian sourced.
Sure.
But they're really high quality and they're really close by, and we get to support farmers.
Exactly. We get to have those conversations, and especially on the malting side, and going back to having a Pilsner equivalent kind of barley base. We're using Troubadour malting, and we're using either their Rhapsody or their Pevich style Pilsner. And the Rhapsody specifically is a really undermodified, pale malted barley. And part of that is also just if the purpose of our turbid mashing is to create as unfermentable a wort as possible to some degree, that use of undermodified malt as well as, a high proportion of completely raw wheat really helps us achieve a starchy, proteinaceous wort by the end of the boil, which has that longevity for if we're not controlling the microbes that inoculate our beer, we have to be able to control on some degree what available sugars and how digestible that wort is. Because we know, especially from doing some research with CSU's fermentation program, much like you would see in traditional lambic, the first microbes that are able to successfully inoculate and start devouring those sugars happen to be Enterobacter, some Pichia, Cloacara, and some lactic acid bacteria. So yeasts and bacteria that aren't necessarily outputting flavors that we find desirable, especially in the early fermentation of the beer, but that create some form of preservation and an environment that allows the more fastidious but more desirable microbes to have the opportunity to slowly grow and then start digesting and converting previous compounds in a way that works without that beer completely spoiling first or molding or anything else like that. So it's usually about 30 days before wild Saccharomyces seems to kick off and start creating the bulk of alcoholic fermentation. And it can be up to, at this point, we're seeing it around 6 to 8 months, but on our, in our first year or two of batches, wasn't probably until 12 to 14 months until we saw Brettanomyces and Pediococcus start to kick in. And, from a qualitative standpoint, you can start to taste how a lot of our young beers have more in common in some way with like almost Hefeweizen.
They really just taste like wheat beers.
Yeah.
They really just taste like orangey wheat beers.
A lot of isoamyl.
Really
yeah. Some 4-vinyl glycol, just a lot of those, Saccharomyces derived compounds at first. And all of a sudden there's this really relatively quick, we tend to find like hydrolysis of the isoamyl acetate, and it just kind of, the banana disappears. And all of a sudden the cloviness starts to go more into like a little bit of leather and a little bit of like horsiness, and the acidity starts to creep up a little bit. And it's a fun transition. Not that there's anything, if we wanted to be like a wild Weizen brewery or something like that, yeah, maybe some of our younger beers could hit in that ballpark. But it's fun to get to taste a barrel and have that transition from Saccharomyces forward to all of a sudden more complexity derived from just the conversion of those compounds.
All of these beers are closer to each other than we might, want to, we keep them in buckets because, the Westerners are
we're Americans.
We're very taxonomic. Like we love to categorize and classify. But often the edges bleed over into each other. And obviously when you're, in a country that brewed both spontaneous beers and wit beers, right next to, anyway, all of these things, you're right. There are common flavors between them because there are common organisms that are doing a lot of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And even going back into the history of those beer styles, no one was controlling the original inoculants. They were just saying, all right, this batch turned out really good. Let's reuse that yeast. And, selectively pressuring through multiple generations in ways that we don't. We only selectively pressure the kind of physical parameters and conditions and the chemistry of our wort in, a single batch every single time.
Right. What about the wheat component of the beer?
Yeah, I mean that's about 40%, and that is Entero raw wheat. Mm-hmm. So that's it's I think even for our maltsters a really easy product to work with because they don't have to do anything to it. Yeah, maybe clean it and get it packaged for us, but that wheat is, a big reason why the first infusion for our turbid mash is, trying to achieve around 113 Fahrenheit to 116, like a nice beta-glucan ferulic acid rest, just to make sure that we're not as gummy as we could be. And at this point, I want to say we've done over, we're about over 60 different turbid mash batches at this point. So I haven't, knock on wood, I haven't had a stuck mash in probably about 35 batches or so,
Nice.
but I can tell you that early on, there was a lot, especially on...
You're making Play-Doh.
Yeah, making a really gummy... Oh, especially in the beginning of a turbid mash, it's so thick, it looks more like just a kind of steaming pile of damp grain, as opposed to, it doesn't really even approximate a mash in that point. But yeah, it's I think you kind of touched on earlier the fact that people have let us use their equipment to make to go through a mash protocol.
Here, let me just do a turbid mash brew on your brew system, right?
Yeah. There's been quite a bit of we'll say ingenuity and fun being able to take 2 vessel systems meant for single infusion mashing and being able to make modifications on them, whether that is someone allowing us to actually put in an additional like ferrule or port lower down in a mash tun, or using we use a double diaphragm pump to also essentially make a makeshift mash basket. So if you think about some of the traditional lambic breweries, they're not at some of those turbid pulls between mash steps, when they're trying to remove and denature the different steps before they are able to fully convert, they won't just lauder through the bottom through like a false bottom. They'll also basically decant off the top and be able to move a lot of that turbid wort very quickly to boiling temperature, or at least above their current enzymatic rest. So we've essentially found like one of those GW Kent like strainer baskets, a double diaphragm pump, and a hose that goes onto like a sieve sock screen gasket. It's probably easier just to like send a picture or something. But what we can...
Podcasts are famous for visual mediums.
Exactly. Yeah, if the listeners can understand exactly what I'm going for here, we're able to not only lauder through the bottom through that false bottom during turbid pulls, we're also using essentially a mash basket to pull off quickly from the top as well. And we don't use that system then after mash out, or when we finally bring it all back and Vorloff recirculate and lauder, but to make sure that we are actually keeping a fair amount of wort unconverted and like I said, highly proteinaceous. That's become a pretty good method for us. So
you must have good friends that you work with if they'll let you
fuck with their systems,
right? Yeah. Weld on new ports to their brew kettles.
Yeah. So part of the
what type of contract do you have to facilitate that? So
what has helped is basically I've produced wort at any brewery that I've kind of worked at, and that's been part of the agreement, is saying like, hey, I'm excited to work with you and help produce whatever kind of beers you're interested in. Want to be of service in any way, whether that's from a theoretical or production standpoint. That's great. But could I also use your system during the downtime for the production of our wort? And, a corollary to that is, if I'm modifying this equipment, or if I'm producing all the wort here for me, I can teach these skills to other brewers in the brewery. We can help to get a little more, get more out of your equipment and get more out of some of the other brewers. If it's
continuing education, sure,
exactly. So it's people helping people. It's a beautiful thing. I think everyone benefits from those kind of relationships.
Learn about decoction mashing too, right?
Oh, totally.
Similar process.
Yeah, if
skills that'll come in handy for them, so off. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean,
more
decoction
more
is
popular,
right.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's a lot of applicability to, even if the purpose is different and if there are slight differences in the technique. For example, when we're turbid mashing, we are only pulling the liquor component of the wort. We're not pulling grist, as opposed to decoction mashing, where there's a heavy grist component also brought into the kettle. But besides that, and the fact that, in decoction mashing, you actually want a digestible wort, and for turbid mashing, we're ready for it to be unfermentable, they actually resemble each other quite a bit. And I think what some people call turbid mashing, like turbid decoctions.
Sure.
Anyway, so yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about hops, because certainly that aged hop component is part of it. You've got surrounding us now, some bales and bales of hops. And I want to talk to you about that kind of contribution to the process. But before we do that, hey, nano brewers, Fermentis, the obvious choice for beverage fermentation, will soon be offering their dry ale and lager yeasts in flexible 100-gram packaging. To learn more about how Fermentis can improve the quality of your fermentation and for the latest on their exciting new product releases, visit fermentis.com. Also, as a brewery owner, you know how important it is to keep your machines running so you don't have to deal with the hassle caused by contamination, recalls, and downtime. Clarion makes food-grade lubricants to protect your equipment from the wear and tear that results in breakdowns that cut into your bottom line. Clarion gives you peace of mind so you can focus on what you do best, pouring out great tasting beverages. Learn more at www.clarionlubricants.com. So hops certainly are an important part of this. Everyone that I've talked to that does, the brew spontaneously, whether, I talked at length with Matt Tarpey of The Veil about that on an episode of the podcast. They've got beautiful bins where they're cycling through and sorting and adding and building this long, like multi-year aged blend to their hops. When I was out at Jester King back in February, Jeff and I popped up to the barn,
the rafters,
climbed up and dug some old, shattered, disgusting, terrible, ugly, awful hops out of there. It was just beautiful. For you, obviously, that's a component of what you do. Talk to me about how you go about achieving that similar kind of impact, because these hops, I think it goes without saying, like the components that they bring to flavor of these beers is absolutely pivotal in how funk develops in spontaneous beers. And without those hops and without some of those specific flavor components that come from that aged hop, that you will not end up with the same quality of funk in the beer.
No, that's quite right. And there's a lot of exciting research occurring. Even I think YCH right now, they've been sending out sample packets where you can take your own aged hops and have them sent into them for analysis, and really working with brewers to understand more and more what we seek out from an aged hop perspective. And the traditional mindset has been, all right, you're going to want to take aged noble hops and hops that are starting with a low alpha. But as we've talked to other people, and as we've even seen from inspirations like Cantillon at this point, I believe, sources mostly American hops, and slightly high, we're not talking 18 alpha acids, but slightly high alphas around like the 11 to 13 range, for that potential for aging and some of the other compounds that, even as you oxidize all of the alphas out, stay around and really leave an imprint in that wort and then that evolving beer. So some of our traditional understanding and the folkloric side of it it gets to run up against modern brewing techniques and is challenged by contemporary brewers in a lot of fun ways. I love the concept of almost that Solera kind of aged hop program that it sounds like The Veil is going for. Our mindset is a little bit different. We're willing to allow complete changes in different batches for aged hop crop years and cultivar. The first few years, we were only taking a bunch of Colorado Willamette and aging those, and then unfortunately, we were essentially taking all of Colorado's Willamette, which was only 800 pounds at the time. So not
Sure.
an exceptionally large amount of hop material, but still for a small brewery like us, quite a bit. And they eventually removed those Willamette fields for I think hemp or something else to grow there that understandably for those farmers got a better return on investment. So then we started, sourcing more Chinook and Cascade and some other cultivars around here, as well as now I'm excited to see how multi-head and some other Neo-Mexicanus hybrids start to age and develop. Given that Neo-Mexicanus is indigenous to this area, that could be another fun developing component of our terroir and going with that whole Colorado only thing at that point. But we've allowed for transitions between those crop years and for those cultivars in different batches, because I think it can allow for that blending potential as we talked about. I don't think we need or desire every barrel to necessarily taste the same. It's good to have some form of predictability in that it's not just turning into vinegar or becoming ethyl acetate but seeing how those cultivars do allow different barrels to age more gracefully or to kind of age more rapidly, those are useful items in terms of our blending arsenal. I will say also from just a storage standpoint, I think we're going a little more like the kind of the Cantillon storage method, which is basically keeping them in the bales whole cone. We're not actually removing them and trying to expedite the oxidation or putting them directly into like burlap sacks. I think the more gradual sensitive oxidation that occurs for those hops over multiple years in bales at ambient temperature, not better or worse, but for a lot of what we're trying to get out of our spontaneous beers, a lot of it is still have those hop compounds, but maybe not to the most prominent level. You can think of some of even Cantillon, that hop bitterness, that hop structure is one of the first things that comes out. And I think that's where a lot of the research has basically been, how do we make beers that taste like Cantillon, not necessarily how do we make beers that taste like Lambic and Goose, because as we get into that infinitesimal of what is Lambic and Goose, if you taste Girardin versus Fontaine and Cantillon, those are three prolifically different beers, even if they have some things in common. So for us, allowing the hops to be a part of it, but maybe not the preeminent component of it, to let some more of the microbial and those fermentative characteristics come to the surface, we've been aiming for a little bit more of a I would say subdued hop Brett aromatic interaction, but still with the structure and the maybe preclusion of high acidification by use of those hops. So basically going back and summarizing in that way, it's how can we allow those hops to age gracefully yet still turn maybe more into straw and hay tasting as opposed to the cheesiest end member that we can get. And a lot of that I think is through just that gradual oxidation and relative constant temperature as opposed to like 120 degrees. Right. Every cone is exposed. Bake them. Yeah, exactly.
There's still a lot of risk to that though, because you are spontaneously inoculating this wort, you're dealing with hops and bales. There can be different alpha levels on the outside of that bale versus the inside of that bale.
Absolutely.
And that can be the difference between a fermentation starting or your bacteria. I mean, the fermentation will start, because wild sac will still operate, but that could be a no acidity versus, a whole bunch of acidity. How do you make sure do you have those tested to kind of check alpha before you start in a brewing season or throughout a season? What does that look like?
We are able to get those tested, and it's basically get the single bale that will be, because that's really 150 pounds in a season is somewhat consistent with maybe we're
about a bale a season.
Yeah, we're about a bale, maybe now moving towards like 2 bales a season. So it's easy enough for us to get a sample from closer to the inside of that bale and work from there and see what that looks like. And generally, we're still working through our Willamette. We haven't really moved on to any of the other cultivars yet. And given that those started in the mid 2s to low 3s, they zeroed out actually relatively quickly. So we might still see differences.
As you get into your Chinooks and whatnot, you're going to have to pay a little closer attention to that.
Exactly. The Chinooks, the multi-head, all of those, anything that has more alphas, we'll be a little more vigilant on. But it is surprising. I mean, let's flip the script back to IPA brewing for a second. We talk about, a perfectly sealed container of, T90 pellets or something like that. And we know that even without necessarily the degradation of the oils and the other compounds in those hops, there's a pretty with a hop storage index rating and for a known cultivar, there's a pretty good understanding of how those alphas are degrading through time. And those are, pellets that have those dense cores and everything else. So yes, it on a short time scale, you're going to see a difference between maybe the middle of that bale versus the exterior. And you'll certainly still see like physical differences in maybe the coloration and some other things like that. But those alphas actually degrade pretty readily and pretty rapidly, especially when they start low, even in the center of those bales in that way too.
Well, I'm going to pay attention in 2025 to see if you have some some batches that don't acidify just to hold you to this.
Right. Well, so actually that kind of goes back to a previous point you brought up in terms of it potentially being too cold at certain times during the year in Colorado and our mindset towards that. And I will say that especially we played with the first brew season was maybe the widest goalposts for our hopping rates and to understand, because we needed to make sure that we had some beers that acidified to some point. But B, we didn't want everything to knowing what we like to drink. We wanted to make sure, okay, we just don't want lactic acid bombs or God forbid, things to just go completely acetic and turn to vinegar quickly. So we played around with some, we'll say post coolship hop hopping rates between about 0.5 to 1.5 pounds per barrel at that point. And I think we found a sweet spot.
Post coolship,
0.5 to 1.5 pounds per barrel.
Not adding the hops post coolship.
No. Sorry. Sorry. I mean,
the measurement being
exactly. I'm specifying
the equivalent of that after
that volume.
After the volumes. Okay.
Exactly right. Because that was one of those parameters that we had a hard time actually figuring out. Okay, how are people measuring their hopping rates? Is it pre-boil, post-boil, post-coolship?
You kind of give it extra water and then it goes away.
It concentrates. Yeah. So I think for us, the most meaningful metric is talking about post coolship volume at that point.
Or post evaporation.
You got it. Exactly right. So in that way, I think that first season we found about 0.75 pounds per barrel post coolship as the sweet spot of what acidified, but was graceful, didn't turn completely lactic too quickly, but also was able to have strong, robust fermentations that included a bacterial component. We have still some barrels from that first season that were up at that 1.5 pounds per barrel mark that never acidified whatsoever and almost taste more like Bière de Garde or kind of like aged Saison in that way, which have a super sack forward structure to them, have quite a bit of now, oaky component because there's not much counterbalancing some of the tannins from, even if they're neutral barrels, they're still absorbing some of that. And have a structured bitterness from those hops. But since that first season, we've now been able to creep up those hop rates, and we knew that, or hoped at least, that a lot of microbial equilibrium in the space would start to shift what that equation looked like. So now we can be hopping around that 1.5 pound per barrel mark, and those beers are still acidifying. And if anything, that's probably what I would consider, the Goldilocks range, which thinking back is twice as much as what was the Goldilocks range in year 1. Now in year 6 is kind of where we're starting to plateau and figure, okay, this is what our beers, would allow them to age gracefully, have still nice structure, and, kind of for our tastes, the right amount of acid balance. So to us, that suggests that this space is holding most of that microbial equilibrium as opposed to just, all of the microbes coming from the outside space.
So what you're saying is that the culture that even lives out here now is growing more hop tolerant.
More hop tolerant and more robust and ready to digest the wort chemistry and the type of beer that we are creating in this space.
As you still load into clean, non-inoculated barrels.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as anyone will tell you, the barrels certainly have some microbial activity deep in those staves, but we are going through a complete physical cleaning, steaming, et cetera, between every batch. So that at least the onset of fermentation isn't a function of something left behind in those barrels, but how those beers might evolve in those specific barrels could have something to do with, the really resilient stuff that is deep within those staves. But what this means for us also is that we can create these beers and have had a lot of success creating coolship inoculated spontaneous beers in seasons or at temperature ranges that you would think of as being too cold for, that microbial activity. So it just means we can fill that coolship up to higher volumes, have the correct cooling rate, and still find the onset of fermentation and the longevity of those beers to be right on target, which is cool.
And some of that also comes because you've been using the coolship so often that, and you have not porous, but a rough hewn wood ceiling above it that can kind of capture that you are building an environment that can live on. And then over time, all of that evaporation is puddings, sugars and whatnot that these, this culture, these, various bacteria and wild yeast can live on. And so just by cool shipping itself, you're creating a friendlier environment for, to help them survive.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely.
And you watch the weather really closely during the coolship season. And if it's going to be extra cold, you'll brew a little, or dilute a little more, or brew extra. Or if it's not quite as cold or it's really humid, you'll brew a little bit less. Like, you're adjusting those dials even on the day.
Absolutely. And being able to adjust then, total grist and everything else accordingly, saying, all right, tonight's going to be, we need to keep this as a,
10 degrees.
Yeah.
Like, it's cold.
It's cold.
Yeah.
We can have that one up at 30 volumetric barrels as opposed to like, all right, we're getting into the end member,
Spring.
in the spring where it's like, all right, it's doing the classic Belgian, mid 50s in the daytime, low 40s at nighttime. It still technically works, but we're going to have to keep that volume considerably lower to still, fall somewhere between that 12 to 18 hour cooling rate. And we're looking to cool down to the mid to high 60s. That for us has been a nice sweet spot. Again, when we talk about selective pressures, I think a huge component of what makes spontaneous beer successful, at least in our space, as well as maybe why there's some folklore against spring and summer brewing in Belgium, really has to do with the onset of initial fermentation temperature. If you take an IPA with a single strain of US01 and start fermenting it at 80 degrees versus 65 degrees, you have a prolifically different fermentation, and that's without the compounding effect of mixed culture microbial activity and all of that. So we also know that breweries like Girardin have a coolship that they keep in their cellar, and they do brew in the summer, and they make lovely lambic at that point. So, our goal certainly isn't to break down folklore for the name of science, but it is interesting to be able to brew according to folklore and with this very qualitative mindset in respect of the tradition, but then use a little bit of scientific understanding to validate or refute some of the commonly spread gospels of lambic in that way.
I love this scientific approach to the world's most romantically produced beer.
And the irony, of course, for me is this is an artistic project, not a scientific project.
You can't take the scientist out of the
Yeah.
Bring all the tools to it that you have.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the approach that we'd expect from somebody making, from folks making great beer. Let's talk a little bit about that kind of fermentation. Now you have 1, 2, 3, 4 year aged beer. You've got a whole bunch of barrels behind us. They're a little bit larger. Talk to me about barrel choice and building that kind of environment for fermentation.
The main stack of our barrels are 500-liter puncheons. They're ex-Barolo barrels, which came to us neutral, but we still get a bunch of oak character, which is really beautiful. They're really thick staves, just by being puncheons. They're not extra thick. And we talked to a bunch of producers in Belgium, and they basically said, you can do it in any size barrel, but the bigger the better. So it's better surface area to volume ratio of touching the wood. It's better porosity through those thicker staves. And we've had better results, the larger barrels we use. We have a couple fooders, but mostly it's these 500-liter puncheons. We've done a few batches in smaller barrels, but sometimes it's hit or miss. Sometimes they go real weird, real fast. But it's nice. We like to finish beers in spirit barrels with or without fruit. So it's sort of everything spends at least 1 to 2 seasons in these barrels, if not longer, the bigger ones. And then we'll do like a spirit barrel or something to finish it.
Just to make it sexy and fun for customers.
Gin barrels, whiskey barrels, port, bourbon barrels, there's all sorts of fun stuff.
Absolutely. And I will say barrel size and barrel selection is a large component of making this style of beer work in this highly evaporative, dry, high, arid desert. So Lisa mentioned it perfectly with that surface area to volume ratio and that tasteful kind of seasonal, breathing of the barrel, shall we say. But a big part of it is also the fact that with that evaporation, you've got now this extra headspace. So in a smaller barrel that has all of a sudden that headspace, there is more of that beer exposed and potentially degrading with time as a function of oxidation than in a larger barrel that develops that headspace. you might have that opportunity to leave that beer in there longer before you start to have the deleterious effects of that oxidation. That's also one of the reasons why, if you look in lambic brewing tradition, your barrels and your foeders are horizontal, as opposed to in Flanders style sour production and some other Belgian sour production, you see upright foeders. Or if you go to like New Belgium's Foeder Forest, you've got the uprights. And the whole idea there is, all of a sudden, with a little bit of evaporation, you've got the entirety, the surface area of that the circle of the foeder, of the barrel, is all of a sudden exposed to oxygen immediately, and that allows for hopefully tasteful development of acetic acid and some more of that acidification as a component of that beer. So,
if they're horizontal, famously visual medium, these podcasts, you have more of like a small oval.
I can see how that is a narrower chunk that gets
vertical.
Exposed, and then even as that continues, it's not the entire.
Yes.
Exactly right. So, for us, larger barrels, and I think this is also true, if you talk to Belgian lambic blenders and brewers out there, the same thing is true, but it might be even more critical for us in this environment to use larger format barrels, especially for that primary fermentation and for that maturation phase. Like Lisa said, especially, later down the line and in the game, use of spirit barrels can work.
Which are typically smaller format.
Yeah. And another,
there's a balance here too, because, and there are American spontaneous beer producers who, swear by foeders. There are some who were using foeders like Degard and have moved away from that. It's a balance between efficiency and also creating enough different varied stock to build a blend from. The smaller a barrel you use, the more processing you're doing, the more in and out, the more potential, for oxygen there is, just in the transferring and whatnot. But there has to be some sort of happy balance between those kinds of things.
We also, anyone out there who wants to give us some foeders, we are ready to accept them. That's one of the limiting factors of why why we only have 3 foeders, as opposed to that. It's not necessarily a selection of like puncheons are perfect size. No larger, please. We definitely would love to have some larger foeders for, I would say, in our perfect vision, we have some larger volumes of stock that age really super gracefully, are super rounded, and just we'll say almost more neutral, spontaneous stock. And then being able to use the punch-ins to salt and pepper that blend to add a little bit, some more of the elements that we want to come to the forefront. Those punch-ins are going to have more decisive flavors and are going to stand out a little bit more on their own. So being able to, like you said, work between those two formats and beers that evolve differently for a number of reasons, but in this case, at least partially a function of those maturation environments, that for us is fun and something that we're looking forward to in the future.
Talk to me about what it looks like then when you decide to start blending. Because
that's the fun part,
right? Because now you've aged this beer, you've got it sitting here, and you start thinking about what beers are we going to make from this stock in any given year, knowing what we have. Talk to me about that process.
Yeah, it's that really is the fun part. You've put in all the work and you've been so patient, and you finally get to blend. We taste through lots of barrels of varying ages. We pick out anything that we think is complete standout on its own, doesn't need to be blended, maybe doesn't, it just is beautiful on its own. And then from there we go, okay, this beer, this barrel is a little more bitter or a little sweeter perceiving or more funky or, more sour, whatever. And then kind of look into like, well, what do we have fruit wise? What's available? Do we have any botanicals we want to use? Are there spirit barrels that we're really excited about? Does anyone want to collaborate? These sort of things. And then take from each of those barrels and blend, or, spirit barrel age or whatever, depending on sort of what they're presenting. But it's really fun to find that one barrel that's good on its own, doesn't need anything. That feels really special.
How does that look? I mean, you don't have, we're not talking about hundreds or thousands of barrels.
No.
Like, it's a somewhat more modest, kind of approach. Do you think about like, what are the beers that we're going to make for the season? Or do you think, oh wait, now we've got some fruit coming and what are we going to make a beer with?
It's a combination of both. So sometimes we get a deal on fruit and we're like, this is Colorado grown. This tastes incredible. Maybe we wouldn't have picked it up on our own, down, out of a catalog, but it's been presented as, hey, this is, ripe. And if you don't process it in a week and a half, it'll turn.
It needs a home.
Yeah. And so we're happy to do that, reduce food waste, taste great, support farmers again. Or we get an email about new barrels that are in town. And we're like, oh, this, port bourbon barrel is amazing. Like, let's pick out a blend that will go in that and then see how that, ages.
We make a lot of impulse buys.
We're impulse shoppers.
For a patient, spontaneous program, we've also got impulsivity.
Yeah, so it's really just like, what options do we have? What are the most recent thing that
You're
was
running a marathon with a sprint finish.
right at the end, we
That's
sprint.
a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, someone gives us the goo pack, and you're like, yes, okay. But I really wanted a spruce tip beer, and so that was more of a, I want this, let's make it. And so Brandon sourced some Colorado spruce tips from Spruce on Tap. Is that right?
Shout out to Spruce on Tap out there for all of your spruce needs.
Yeah,
that's
it's a
just a
Colorado
business.
company.
That's a business. Yeah.
And then we used the gin barrel, and it turned out wonderfully. So I was really excited. That was one that was like, I specifically want this. Let's make this. But typically it's a little more loose, I think.
Yeah. And to that question, a lot of times the gamblers in us are tasting beers and saying, do we think this beer has more potential for evolution? Is taking the beer out of this barrel right now potentially cutting short the life or the evolution of something that can be truly special if given more time? And you never know the answer to that. And a number of different parameters that are unpredictable to us can very much shape that barrel. But having used some of these barrels multiple times now, you can start to get an idea of, okay, we've had beers that have gotten to the 3-year mark in this barrel. Let's take the risk. Let's put it all on it versus, that barrel. Sometimes it's just a physical function of that barrel. It's like, I think the 1 to 2 year mark is perfect on this. Let's not push it anymore. I think it's primed right now. So when we taste, there is definitely a function of, making sure that we have full use of the best beer that we can for this season without taking away the best beer that there could be for next season, which is an impossible game to play, but certainly presents, it's fun. It's okay to be wrong too.
The two of you work together when blending.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Building, across any kind of team, and it's different because you're a married couple and you spend a lot of time together.
We do spend a lot of time together.
But in any kind of team, a common language so that, is important so that you are understanding and communicating what you are perceiving. Even though you all potentially taste things in slightly different ways, all human beings do, being able to describe what those things and what they mean so that you understand each other is important.
Yep.
Talk to me about some of that language and that means of articulating things that you've developed. Is there any shorthand, that you all use to describe things?
Yeah. We definitely talk about like, how does this perceive and how does it feel? I mean, when you're drinking it, and then we sort of take time and say, specifically flavors, like what do you get? And there's a lot of some flavors come up over and over, like honey and like burnt honey. We get a lot of pineapple and over fermented pineapple, those kinds of flavors we always talk about. And then we try and say, okay, does this remind you of anything? And then I don't know. What do you think?
I think you're right on. What I will say has been helpful with our commonality of language is you are sensory trained. I am sensory trained from other brewery environments, and actually being able to not only identify quote unquote all flavors, but
actually drill down and say, this flavor, what is this?
Right.
Rather than just being like, I like something about this. You have to be able to specifically.
Having some of those defined sensory descriptors, even if there's a lot more allowable and a lot of fun, more interesting, funky descriptors that we can use for this, we are able to start working from a very common descriptive language, which helps. And also through, classic sensory, knowing where my blind spots are and knowing where your blind spots are, or what we are both respectively more sensitive to. I am super sensitive to ethyl acetate, which, for better or worse, is a common flavor that can develop in these beers.
Quantities, I'm like, oh, this is so fruity. I love it.
And I'm already picking up Sharpie and
so we watch that on each other. And then, maybe like acetic acid, we're pretty careful because I feel like we're both pretty sensitive to that.
Yep. and you're more sensitive probably, or have a slightly lower threshold for enjoyment of phenols and some of the some of those characteristics where you can throw a bunch of phenols at me and I'm like, that's pretty fun. So there is a fun being able to communicate and trust each other in that way of saying, I don't taste what you're tasting, but I know that you do. And if we can, between the two of us, come up with what we think is a great blend, bring a couple other friends and a couple other people that we, believe also have good sensory and robust sensitivities to things that we can't pick up as easily. That's our best bet of putting out something that is most enjoyable, hopefully, to people out there. I don't think our intention has ever been to put out the most intense in any one direction beer of any
sort.
Sort.
We're trying not to.
Right. Even at our highest fruiting rates, that, when fruit is prominent, we don't want it to be the most intensely fruity thing that you've ever tasted. Certainly not the most intensely hoppy, as we discussed, or acidic, or any of those things. Balance is something that we strive for only because that's what we are selfish and enjoy ourselves. And taking some cues from other low intervention or minimalist or natty, whatever you want to call it, other fermentation styles outside of lambic goose or sour beer brewing. I mean, being able to taste different ciders and wines and other fermentations that were like, oh, that's so good. Like, how do we?
What about it is so good?
Right. What do we like about this? What is working, and how can elements of this beverage inspire blends of spontaneous beer? Even if it is in the tradition of lambic, it doesn't mean that we're aiming to clone lambic or goose or like we said in that perfect example before.
Is there a specific example of that, where you tasted something or like, I bet we can, find some way to, express this type of character using.
In some ways, Basque style cider has been a fun inspiration. Bringing that up, that's a rather intense fermentation a lot of times, whether it goes more acetic or goes more
but there's other
phenolic
layers in there that are really enviable.
Yeah,
the flavors.
That's a nice way of putting it. So we've definitely tasted some Basque style ciders that we've said, all right, with maybe some, I think Basque style cider has inspired some of our sweet cherry refermentations. We did one on Rainier cherries that to us, all of a sudden, the way that a golden sweet cherry compared to a red sour cherry referments is like night and day. You get so many different compounds output by those golden cherries that are almost more like vegetal and overturned forest floor, which are not, better or worse than other characteristics, but being able to taste those and say like, okay, maybe we want to push this in a direction that reminds us of Basque style cider in some ways, not again, trying to clone that beverage. And I think that has helped. And ciders. We've definitely done a lot of other besides Basque style ciders.
I was going to say natural white wines too. Yeah. There's a lot of really cool similarities flavor wise, but
I'm like Grüner Veltliner and some even non right. Yeah, we've done some. We've got a desire to play around with riddling and degorging at some point, and we took
our beers. I'm really excited.
Yeah,
it'll be fun. It'll be a lot of work.
Ode Beersel makes this incredible beer, Bizart, which is taking their lambic but champanizing it, shall we say? Right. And it every time we have a bottle of that, it just blows my mind. Both the Creek, which is going for more like a rosé, versus just their Millissima, lambic that is hitting those champagne vibes, and that use of both the champagne inspiration and some of the flavors you can get out of that, as well as there are some, natural process champagnes that are oak fermented and don't go, have some degree of funk to them. I think there's a lot of intersectionality for fermentations around that.
When it comes to fruit, do you, obviously you've got a constraint of using Colorado fruit. You've got a number of fruit processing equipment pieces right behind us as we're sitting right here. So clearly you're taking whole fruit, you're processing them yourselves and then adding that. Are there some specific fruits that you found you enjoy going to more than others? And are there some methods for adding those that you found yourself leaning towards?
Absolutely. And I will say we are continuously learning what those different fruits, especially year to year, and being able to taste a piece of fresh fruit and have some assessment of what that looks like, or what that might look like from a fermentative standpoint. Cherries, especially Montmorency and Balaton cherries, are for us kind of always, I would say, always towards a success. I think by virtue of cherries being super antioxidative, they are easy to work with. We can take some beer and know that they'll re-ferment on those cherries and not, and have the potential to then age gracefully afterwards.
I was gonna say we've done a lot of peach batches, but we like nectarines better. Sometimes it depends, but sometimes those, maybe because they don't have the fuzz, there seems to be like a cleaner, more candy fruit forward profile, which if you want the funk, that's also great, but sometimes you just want like a candy sweet fruit beer, and those are really fun. And then apricot in that same family, we've been
failing a lot.
Yeah, we've been really struggling with, because they get so malic.
And therefore so acidic with development.
And so you have to pick such a plain, mild base beer if possible, and then even then sometimes you overshoot it, so...
we've had 2 batches of apricot beers that I would say were failures that will never see the light of day.
Which is so hard to do. It's so sad. It takes so much time.
Oh, yeah, but it's just leading into our craft vinegar project that we'll release someday.
Oh, yeah.
And if anything, much like those homebrewer days of understanding, okay, it doesn't mean that they were bad apricots, and it doesn't mean that our beer is bad. It just means there's a process that needs to be tweaked or something that needs to be understood. And after having some fun conversations with, let's give a shout out to Eric Schmidt and Amalgam Brewing, and some of their turbulence with apricot in the past, and some other sour brewers. This season we've had what I'm considering a phenomenal apricot re-fermentation that is now in bottles, and as long as things continue favorably on that trajectory, I'm excited to release our first apricot beer. And a big part of that was really a function of fruiting rate and contact time for a lot of those stone fruits, apricots, peaches, and even nectarines to some degree. Initially, we were doing
way too long,
huge fruit loads and way too long, and then we were doing lesser fruit loads for way too long.
So basically just being able to have a tank ready, put the beer on, and then take it off when it's tasting good. Weeks in.
Whereas
rather than months.
Yeah. Other fruits like cherries, you can have an enormous fruit load and leave them on quote unquote way too long, and it's perfect.
Yeah.
You get, with those cherries, and I think a big part of it is, again, that antioxidative quality of that fruit. The longer you leave it on, because we're leaving the pits and all of that, you are now starting to extract the fun pit flavors, whether it's Noyo or something similar, more complexity from the skins of the cherries, and, maybe a bit more color from the flesh and all of that too. So we've definitely adapted our fruiting rates, our time that the beer spends on the fruit. In general, the beers that we're putting on fruits tend to be lower acidity, more neutral base, because we know nearly every fruit is going to add the at least perception of greater acidity, whether it's a function of that re-fermentation nudging up the lactic acidity, the actual organic acids that are in the fruits, etc. So knowing that even going into the bottle, we want everything to be less acidic than we want when it's finally all, package conditioned, because then that last overlaying feature is going to be carbonic acid and the perception of carbonation and uplifting of other volatiles. And, I think again, along those qualitative lines, it matters more how the balance feels necessarily than how the acidity measures.
Sure. And all of that fruiting happens in stainless steel tanks?
Not all of it.
Not all of it?
Some of it's in barrels.
The stainless steel re-fermentation is really only for our largest and what we would consider kind of like the fruit re-fermentations that we are willing to put a lot of beer into, and know that, like, all right, we've done cherries now, 5 seasons in a row. We can get 3,000 pounds of cherries and put 4 puncheons on them, and this is let's go for it.
And then second use them.
And exactly be able to use them a second time, mostly then for some of our cask beers and the younger still stuff. But for other projects, it was like, I've never used that fruit, or, we've messed up apricots 2 times already. Like, are we willing to go that deep into it? In those cases, we'll generally re-ferment in either 2 or 4 225 liter or 200-liter barrels, depending on whether we're going with a American oak versus like French or Hungarian oak. So we certainly do some barrel re-fermentations as well. You just have more logistical from a cleanup as well as debarreling issues to worry about going from a barrel re-fermentation as opposed to our stainless re-fermenters or those Hoover tanks that we have manways right on the front. We can put sieve gaskets, everywhere. We're not doing any filtration or fining or anything like that, but using a series of fining sieve gaskets, we can remove a lot of that fruit material and pulp out of the equation. Plus, then once beer is moved off the fruit, we are often giving it another about a month in like a cylindrical conical blending tank to really allow anything else that was in suspension to settle out, for that beer to become a little bit rounder, and also just to make sure that we have a good understanding of what that terminal gravity is at this point, so that when we go for bottle blending, we're not creating something in the end that has a lack or an abundance of carbonation there too. So from a geologic standpoint, cylindrical conicals allow for really good fine. I mean, that's the purpose of them from a yeast standpoint, but allows for really great fruit fining in that way too.
From
and
a geologic standpoint?
Yeah, we
Sure.
Strata, right?
Strata and sediment traps. When we used to deploy those to the bottom of lakes, they were in conical formation as well. So just a little callback to geology.
Callback.
Yeah.
I see it. And then for that re-fermentation in the bottles, obviously your bottle conditioning, what does that process look like for you?
We either use local honey or young spontaneous beer as a primary sugar.
Mm-hmm.
We do cork and crown, just to sort of do homage to various breweries that we really respect, plus better oxygen scrubbing. And then we age them on their sides in cages, about 72 to 75 degrees for at least 3 months, sometimes 6 to 8 months, depending if they're a little slower.
Or 12, 12 if it's an unfruited beer that hasn't had that is at 3 years of age and hasn't seen sugar in too many moons. And it takes some time for those, not necessarily for the carbonation. I would say we typically find our beers to be nearly fully carbonated 2 to 3 months in, but it's really any additional time is all about cohesion and making sure that all of the intermediate, like THP, is removed from the equation. That even if there are no red flags from a sensory standpoint of like, I don't get diacetyl, I don't get acetaldehyde, I don't get any of these things, like, does it taste exactly how you want it to? Does it, is this where it should be yet? And, a lot of times that's
we're still waiting on one.
Yeah. We're just like, no, not yet. But,
it's been a while.
Yeah. And that can happen. And sometimes some of our favorite beers have gone through the most tumultuous of roller coasters. We're like, I don't know if it's ever coming out of this. And then when it finally does, you're like, oh yeah, this is
worth the wait.
Yeah, this is worth the wait. So the bottle conditioning is that whole next step of that process. It's been fun to release beers still, and we will always continue to have our equivalent to young lambic or even Oda lambic in that way of no carbonation, just being sent through the beer engines and the sparkler. And that was really early on in the business. We had the decision, all right, do we want to make other mixed culture fermentations or saison or even, pale ale and be doing that to keep paying the bills and eventually release our spontaneous beer. And eventually we decided pretty quickly that no, that's not the route we want to take, because it might become too easy to be successful at making other styles of beer and making money and realizing like, how can we justify only making, method traditional spontaneous beer? So we went the other route, which was...
You weren't kidding about the socialist thing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Heaven forbid we should be successful.
We don't want to make money.
We've been known to make other styles of beer at other breweries. I mean, I've put an IPA or two together previously, but like, no, we knew that we wanted to go all in on this and really just use this as an opportunity for developing expertise, which should, take the rest of our lives to get anywhere near there. But in that way, having 2 to 3 years of understanding our beer, the evolution and how it drinks, even just evolving in cask. And then, I think that led to a lot of early success with bottle conditioning because we understood our beer.
I was gonna say at our grand opening, we had old beer. We had like 9-month to a year old beer, but I look back on like what that tasted like, and it was so young. Like it tasted so young. But it's just what we had, and we couldn't wait, 2-3 years to open. We wanted to do it after 1 year. So
yeah, and we still like finding some of those young examples,
Totally.
and be like, oh yeah, let's put that in a cask because it's fruity and it's
without having fruit.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's a long time to get to know our beers, which was cool.
Sure. Now that you all are taking this next step, COVID is starting to wind down a little bit. Thankfully, places are able to operate. You're getting back to reopening the tap room now, serving beer directly to customers in a way that hasn't happened for the last 18 plus months. Mm-hmm. As you start thinking about next steps for the brewery, what does success look like? What are the ultimate goals for Primitive? When will you know that you've achieved what you set out to do? Or do those goalposts move for you over time?
Yeah.
These are conversations that we are having
Daily.
a lot of right now. So that hits home in a lot of ways.
Well, right now we're open 4 days a week, just 4 to 6 hours in the afternoons, evenings, and we've been.
And you all are tending bar too.
It's really just brand.
Yeah. If you, I am trapped here. So if you're looking for where I'm hanging out, between Friday and Monday, I will be here. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's that, and we've added a guest list and a cellar list, so we've kind of expanded that program, which is really cool. You get to drink lambic and goose alongside our method traditional. As far as further in the future, we're still figuring it out. I think we want to keep our operation fairly small, probably this size or a tiny bit bigger, but not really looking to get crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, previously we've been just back of envelope. We've probably been filling about 200 to 250 volumetric barrels of spontaneous beer a year, but we've only been releasing, I think the first year was 20 volumetric barrels, and
big
a massive increase to year 2, which was 40 volumetric barrels, and I think maybe this year will be like 60 volumetric barrels, something like that. So there's we've been putting a lot of stock into aging development, turning barrels through that just haven't evolved in ways that we see fit. So that at this point that we have a lot of beer that we're excited for that we can now turn into fun projects and be able to, put more into package. So, that doesn't require us increasing our scale. It really just requires us to, package a bit more. And the goal will never be to be the, Brewery bone of American spontaneous beer. We're never going to have the largest stock. I think Crooked Stave is already beating us considerably, and they're making incredible spontaneous beer. So,
sure.
Our goal will never be like the most intense in that way, but is, making the beers that we at least have our imprint on them, or at least have our,
Maybe a goal is to not let any barrels, turn that were too old. Like if something is 3 or 4 years, make sure it gets packaged and used in a blend rather than letting it go too far.
Dedicating our time as a resource so that the time we put in doesn't spoil that beer or that batch. That's certainly a goal. But I would say another goal that we're working towards is, with outside of the realm of spontaneous beer is also spontaneous fermentation of other sugar substrates. So in that way, working on minimalist or low intervention wines and ciders as well, that almost becomes something with a little more breadth because there are so many different techniques we can apply to that. We won't necessarily hold ourselves to one sort of spontaneous re-fermentation tradition in that, even if for beer we're just, we're sticking to lambic inspiration method traditional. I would say that, if I'm thinking 10, 20 years in advance, and because I want to do this the rest of my life, that's what we're trying to set up for now is sustainability from a career standpoint and from a climate and everything else standpoint, is what does primitive beer look like when Pearl starts growing up? And, is there a business that we can one day hand over, within the family? And
should she want to?
Exactly. She can either be a geologist or a brewer. She's got two choices. Or a geologist who brews, on the side.
Brewer who does geology.
I know, right? All of these possibilities, amateur geology. But it would be amazing to someday have a parcel of land, our own kind of area that, we can always be fermenting things, and whether that, has a separate space for lambic inspired beers and for natural process wines and ciders. And I wasn't really joking about the vinegar either. I think artisanal spontaneous vinegar. We've had some craft vinegars from other spontaneous beer producers that have been.
Was it native? Native species.
Native root.
Native. Oh man.
Anyway,
it was just called native vinegar.
Yeah.
From Strange Roots in Pennsylvania is the best vinegar. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Barrel aged spontaneous vinegar. It's so good.
Yeah.
We use it in everything.
Yeah, you don't. Yeah, it's not drinking vinegar.
Sure.
But used in a meal and cooking and that kind of thing. So someday I don't know what that looks like. Whether that's in Belgium and we're actually making lambic, or if that's in Colorado still, or the Hudson Valley of New York, from kind of where I'm from. I'm not. I think that's still really nebulous, and we're going to keep riding that wave. But in the near term, I think being able to take our beers and approach more restaurants and approach more kind of bars and eateries that are focused on those other natural fermentations that don't really look at beer, and trying to show that there might be more continuity or more similarity in flavor in flavor profile, as well as process, between the beers that we make and other styles of fermentation, rather than maybe other 3-week turnaround beers. So I think that's going to be, as socialists, now eventually taking money from this project, we will have to find a way to make that money. So that, I think, means, from my limited understanding, means selling more beer. And that's like, all right,
it's one option.
Yeah, what does that
That
look
could
like?
be it.
Yeah,
We don't know.
yeah.
I always look at it not as selling more, but as making more people happy.
Aww.
That
All right, I'm in. Let's go.
We just sold Brandon on the idea of selling more beer.
when we sell more magazines, we are making more people happy, or we're fulfilling some need that they have, and we do better because we're delivering more and more what people want.
I like that.
And so, hey, I hope you all continue to make people happy.
I appreciate that.
you.
I'm glad that we're making anyone happy. We're certainly making ourselves happy, which was step one. And if
Sure.
step 2 can be make other people happy, then we're gonna have to figure out what a step 3 looks like. That's
Yeah,
the
who
future.
knows?
We'll leave that one to Pearl.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The future.
Well, thank you for joining me for this episode of the podcast. G&D's micro-channel condensers use a fraction of the refrigerant over traditional chillers. T45 lupulin-enriched hop pellets contain a higher concentration of aromatic oils and bittering resins with a reduced level of polyphenols and plant material. Old Orchard prides themselves on consistent product and reliable supply. ProBrew has the equipment, systems, and technology to take your brewery production to the next level. Fermentus offers dry ale and lager yeasts in flexible 100-gram packaging, and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. If you would like to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button. Do it right now, because next Thursday, the annual Best in Beer issue comes out. And if you want to see it first, you have to be a subscriber to the magazine. You will get it on your email the moment it gets released. So go subscribe now at beerandbrewing.com. We also have all access subscriptions that bundle the magazines with exclusive digital and video content. And we've got some great class. We have a great class out right now with Vinny Chilurzo and Taylor Lane from Russian River Brewing on oxygen in the brewing process. And if you've ever wanted to watch Vinny hand bottle and using a variety of different hand bottling methods, purging, not purging, length of purge, etc., swirl, capping on foam, and then throwing him into an Anton Par TPC 5000 to see what the results of those methods are. This is the class for you.
I love that.
It's pretty awesome. And you can find that all on beerandbrewing.com. Lisa and Brandon, if people want to learn more about primitive beer, where do they find you?
We have a website, primitive.beer. We have an Instagram, primitive beer, and that's the main things.
Yeah, it's mostly through the social medias, and
you can reach out with questions.
Totally.
We love to interact with people.
Yeah, anyone who has geeky or not so geeky questions on any of this, we're down to chat all the time. So this is the kind of stuff that, in a positive way, keeps us up at night.
In a good way.
Yeah,
sure. And if they happen to be in Colorado, you are just a little bit north of Denver
Yes,
here in
please
Longmont.
visit us.
Yeah, I'll be here. So love to meet you all and put some names to faces. But yeah, at this point and going forward for the foreseeable future, Fridays are 4 to 8, Saturdays and Sundays are 2 to 8, and Mondays are 4 to 8. So yeah, right up here in just south of downtown Longmont.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for joining for the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.